Hello, welcome to the Short Story Workshop. My name is Matt Bowles. I'm here with Melody Bowles and Simone King. This week we'll be reading Henry and Eliza by Jane Austen, followed by a discussion. First, Mel, why don't you tell us why you picked this story?
Because it's completely mad and I love Eliza so much.
I think completely mad is an accurate description.
Yeah, I've never been more astounded in my life. I had to check I was reading the right thing.
This is Jane Austen of Pride and Prejudice fame, but when she was much younger, and it's just a fun story. It's just fun. Okay, here it is. It's Henry and Eliza by Jane Austen.
As Sir George and Lady Harcourt were superintending the labours of their haymakers, rewarding the industry of some by smiles of approbation, and punishing the idleness of others by a cudgel, they perceived lying closely concealed beneath the thick foliage of a haycock a beautiful little girl not more than 3 months old. Touched with the enchanting graces of her face, and delighted with the infantine though sprightly answers she returned to their many questions, they resolved to take her home, and, having no children of their own, to educate her with care and cost. Being good people themselves, their first and principal care was to incite in her a love of virtue and a hatred of vice, in which they so well succeeded, Eliza having a natural turn that way herself, that when she grew up she was the delight of all who knew her. Beloved by Lady Harcourt, adored by Sir George, and admired by all the world, she lived in a continued course of uninterrupted happiness till she had attained her 18th year, when happening one day to be detected in stealing a banknote of £50, she was turned out of doors by her inhuman benefactors. Such a transition to one who did not possess so noble and exalted a mind as Eliza would have been death, but she, happy in the conscious knowledge of her own excellence, amused herself as she sat beneath a tree, with making and singing the following lines: "Though misfortunes my footsteps may ever attend, I hope I shall never have need of a friend, as an innocent heart I will ever preserve, and will never from virtue's dear boundaries swerve." Having amused herself some hours with this song and her own pleasing reflections, she arose and took the road to M, a small market town, of which place her most intimate friend kept the Red Lion. To this friend she immediately went, to whom, having recounted her late misfortune, she communicated her wish of getting into some family in the capacity of humble companion. Mrs. Wilson, who was the most amiable creature on earth, was no sooner acquainted with her desire than she sat down in the bar and wrote the following letter to the Duchess of F., the woman whom of all others she most esteemed: "To the Duchess of F. Receive into your family, at my request, a young woman of unexceptionable character, who is so good as to choose your society in preference to going to service. Hasten and take her from the arms of your Sarah Wilson." The Duchess, whose friendship for Mrs. Wilson would have carried her any lengths, was overjoyed at such an opportunity of obliging her, and accordingly set out immediately on the receipt of her letter for the Red Lion, which she reached the same evening. The Duchess of F. was about 45 and a half. Her passions were strong, her friendships firm, and her enmities unconquerable. She was a widow, and had only one daughter, who was on the point of marriage with a young man of considerable fortune. The Duchess no sooner beheld our heroine than, throwing her arms around her neck, she declared herself so much pleased with her, that she was resolved they never more should part. Eliza was delighted with such a protestation of friendship, and after taking a most affecting leave of her dear Mrs. Wilson, accompanied her Grace the next morning to her seat in Surrey. With every expression of regard did the Duchess introduce her to Lady Harriet, who was so much pleased with her appearance that she besought her to consider her as her sister, which Eliza with the greatest condescension promised to do. Mr. Cecil, the lover of Lady Harriet, being often with family, was often with Eliza. A mutual love took place, and Cecil, having declared his first, prevailed on Eliza to consent to a private union, which was easy to be effected, as the Duchess's chaplain, being very much in love with Eliza himself, would, they were certain, do anything to oblige her. The Duchess and Lady Harriet being engaged one evening to an assembly, they took the opportunity of their absence and were united by the enamoured chaplain. When the ladies returned, their amazement was great at finding instead of Eliza the following note: "Madam, we are married and gone. Henry and Eliza Cecil." Her Grace, as soon as she had read the letter, which sufficiently explained the whole affair, flew into the most violent passion, and after having spent an agreeable half hour in calling them by all the shocking names her rage could suggest to her, sent out after them 300 armed men, with orders not to return without their bodies, dead or alive, intending that if they should be brought to her in the latter condition, to have them put to death in some torture-like manner after a few years of confinement. In the meantime, Cecil and Eliza continued their flight to the Continent, which they judged to be more secure than their native land, from the dreadful effects of the Duchess's vengeance, which they had so much reason to apprehend. In France they remained 3 years, during which time they became the parents of 2 boys, and at the end of it Eliza became a widow without anything to support either her or her children. They had lived since their marriage at the rate of 18,000 a year, of which Mr. Cecil's estate being rather less than the 20th part, they had been able to save but a trifle, having lived to the utmost extent of their income. Eliza, being perfectly conscious of the derangement in their affairs, immediately on her husband's death set sail for England, in a man of war of 55 guns which they had built in their more prosperous days. But no sooner had she stepped on shore at Dover, with a child in each hand, than she was seized by the officers of the Duchess, conducted by them to a snug little Newgate of their ladies, which she had erected for the reception of her own private prisoners. No sooner had Eliza entered her dungeon than the first thought which occurred to her was how to get out of it again. She went to the door, but it was locked. She looked at the window, but it was barred with iron. Disappointed in both her expectations, she despaired of effecting her escape, when she fortunately perceived in a corner of her cell a small saw and ladder of ropes. With the saw she instantly went to work, and in a few weeks had displaced every bar but one, to which she fastened the ladder. A difficulty then occurred which for some time she knew not how to obviate. Her children were too small to get down the ladder by themselves, nor would it be possible for her to take them in her arms when she did. At last she determined to fling down all her clothes, of which she had a large quantity, and then having given them strict charge not to hurt themselves, threw her children after them. She herself with ease descended by the ladder, at the bottom of which she had the pleasure of finding her little boys in perfect health and fast asleep. Her wardrobe she now saw a fatal necessity of selling, both for the preservation of her children and herself. With tears in her eyes she parted with these last relics of her former glory, and with the money she got for them, bought others more useful, some playthings for her boys, and a gold watch for herself. But scarcely was she provided with the above-mentioned necessaries than she began to find herself rather hungry, and had reason to think, by their biting off 2 of her fingers, that her children were much in the same situation. To remedy these unavoidable misfortunes, she determined to return to her old friends, Sir George and Lady Harcourt, whose generosity she had so often experienced, and hoped to experience as often again. She had about 40 miles to travel before she could reach their hospitable mansion, of which having walked 30 without stopping, she found herself at the entrance of a town, where often in happier times she had accompanied Sir George and Lady Harcourt to regale themselves with a cold collation at one of the inns. The reflections that her adventures since the last time she had partaken of these happy junketings afforded her, occupied her mind for some time, as she sat on the steps at the door of a gentleman's house. As soon as these reflections were ended, she arose, and determined to take her station at the very inn she remembered with so much delight, from the company of which, as they went in and out, she hoped to receive some charitable gratuity. She had but just taken her post at the inn-yard before a carriage drove out of it, and on turning the corner at which she was stationed, stopped to give the postillion an opportunity of admiring the beauty of the prospect. Eliza then advanced to the carriage, and was going to request their charity, when on fixing her eyes on the lady within it, she exclaimed, "Lady Harcourt!" to which the lady replied, "Eliza." "Yes, madam, it is the wretched Eliza herself." Sir George, who was also in the carriage, but too much amazed to speak, was proceeding to demand an explanation from Eliza of the situation she was then in, when Lady Harcourt, in transports of joy, exclaimed, "Sir George, Sir George, she is not only Eliza, our adopted daughter, but our real child." "Our real child! What, Lady Harcourt, do you mean? You know you never even was with child. Explain yourself, I beseech you." "You must remember, Sir George, that when you sailed for America you left me breeding." I do. Go on, dear Polly." 4 months after you were gone, I was delivered of this girl, but dreading your just resentment of her not proving the boy you wished, I took her to a haycock and laid her down. A few weeks afterwards you returned, and fortunately for me, made no inquiries on the subject. Satisfied within myself with the welfare of my child, I soon forgot I had one, insomuch that when we shortly after found her in the very haycock I had placed her, I had no more idea of her being my own than you had, and nothing, I will venture to say, would have recalled the circumstance to my remembrance, but my thus accidentally hearing her voice, which now strikes me as being the very counterpart of my own child's. The rational and convincing account you have given of the whole affair, said Sir George, leaves no doubt of her being our daughter, and as such I freely forgive the robbery she was guilty of. A mutual reconciliation then took place, and Eliza, ascending the carriage with her 2 children, returned to that home from which she had been absent nearly 4 years. No sooner was she reinstated in her accustomed power at Harcourt Hall than she raised an army with which she entirely demolished the Duchess's Newgate, snug as it was, and by that act gained the blessings of thousands and the applause of her own heart. So, did you enjoy this story, is my first question.
I enjoyed it a lot. I love her weirdly satirical tone throughout. A lot of the things that happen are very far-fetched, but you can tell that there's a joke in there somewhere, and she's laughing while she's writing it, and that comes across, and it just makes it fun to read.
I do like the tone of gentle mockery. It's like she read a Dickens book and was like, what is happening here? And then decided to just completely satirize it. I mean, not necessarily Dickens, but like, you know, any of those stories where there's a long-lost daughter, but they'll get through everything because they're just so good, and all of these coincidences, and it's just like she's laughing at their bad writing. I did enjoy it. I sat there blinking to myself, increasingly speechless, and I had to check the author 3 times just to check it was actually Jane Austen.
Her novels that she wrote much later in her life, while more serious, are often about how ridiculous life was at the time, especially for women. And you can see the elements of satire, they're in there somewhere.
So this is a story from a collection that gets called her Juvenilia collection, and it's sort of a bunch of different bits and pieces she wrote, I think, from the ages of 12 to 18. So she wrote this when she was a teenager. It was for Miss Cooper, who's 5 years older than her. She went to school with. I think she probably wrote this to be entertaining and to read aloud.
She was just writing for fun at this point. I don't think she was until she was 18 that she was like started taking her writing seriously.
You don't really fully commit to it until a bit later, do you? And start thinking about like your great novel. Like anyone who's thinking about their great novel when they're 13 is likely pretentious.
Maybe. Yeah, she wrote this when she was young, and I think it's supposed to be sort of a parody of parlour tales, which are supposed to probably have some sort of moral to them, because she makes a big deal out of how Eliza is, you know, so gracious and good and has all these virtues. I think Eliza is great, but I'm not sure she's virtuous particularly.
Well, it's a theme I think that's often in her novels, for example, to judge someone based on their actions rather than their words. So you don't need to trust the narrator just for saying that people are good when they're clearly proving otherwise.
Yeah, I do like that the narrator was like, and everyone loved her, and they thought she was great, and even the chaplain fell in love with her.
I think this is something of an inside joke because all the characters are named after her relatives, and Eliza is her cousin.
Did she not like her cousin?
I don't know, but I think she's kind of poking fun at the fact that everyone seems to like her, maybe.
So Henry was the name of her favourite brother.
And it's funny because, would you believe it, later in life, Henry married Eliza, his cousin, yes. I just imagine Jane Austen being like, you know, called it. Saw it from when I was 13 years old.
Probably not on 18,000 a year, but like, you know.
No, it's a gross misrepresentation, I think.
Yeah, I think my favourite thing about this is I honestly can't decide which bit's my favourite, because the bit where the children bite off her fingers is just so good. The bit where she just runs off with Henry is great. The fact that the Duchess throws her in prison, oh my god.
Cannibalism before Thomas Harris made it cool.
The fact that she somehow makes the ladder with materials left in her jail cell.
No, that's the thing. There's a ladder.
Yeah, the ladder was already there.
There's a ladder in the cell. It doesn't make any sense.
Like, the Duchess is just incompetent. And she throws her children out the window.
But they're fine.
And they're just magically asleep by the time that she gets down. Because it's just, such a dull experience to be thrown out of a window by your parent figure.
The fact that at the end, the people who adopted her turn out to be her real parents, so they forgive her for stealing a £50 banknote. It's just, oh my god, it's a scream. I love it.
Every time you think it won't get weirder, it does.
It's such a weird ending, but it fits the tone of the story because nothing makes sense anyway, I suppose.
Also, was she talking from, the age of 3 months?
Look, it says that she was, but that's ridiculous.
I mean, clearly Eliza is just exceptional and beautiful and good in all ways. And God granted her speech because she just has so many important things to say.
Yeah, she talked her way into being adopted at 3 months old. It's definitely how it went.
I think the part where her mother leaves her under the haycock or whatever is an inside joke as well, because Jane Austen's mother would pass them off to a neighbour after her children were born for 12 to 18 months so that she didn't have to do the annoying raising the baby part. Very weird thing that happened. I guess because she ended up having a lot of kids. She was like, I can't be dealing with this nonsense. There's a woman I know who'll just take care of my children until they're maybe 2 years old and then I can handle them.
I mean, that used to be quite common back in the day, didn't you? You had staff to look after your kids. You've made it when you don't have to parent.
So I think that was kind of what the joke at the end there was, that she didn't realise she was her own child.
Yeah, she just forgot.
Yeah. I mean, somehow, you forget labour and being pregnant. It's not traumatic at all.
I guess to Jane Austen it seemed like quite a nonchalant thing to do. To just pass off your children to someone else.
I mean, given the amount of stories that seem to have, lost heirs returning, suddenly there's a twist at the end.
That's true. It could be that.
I've read Pride and Prejudice, and it feels quite realistic. There is humour there, but it comes from the characters who act in a way I could see real people acting like. The humour here is just how absurd the whole thing is from the start to the end. I mean, I love it because I never know what's going to happen, but I was quite surprised that Jane Austen wrote this.
I don't know, Mr. Darcy's pretty silly sometimes.
Yeah, it's true, he is, but...
There are comic characters in Jane Austen's novels, but clearly she'd grown up by then. It's a much more subtle kind of humour.
There's something so gleeful about this story, which I really like.
Yeah, it's just fun.
I think as you become older, you try and make things more serious and feel like everything has a deeper meaning, and if it's just ridiculous and silly and fun, it's not worth anything. So I think it's a good reminder that that's not true.
I think Jane Austen would be quite surprised to know that 100 years later people were laughing about her story.
It's funny as well because you couldn't sell this story to anyone if you tried.
You really couldn't. If I got given this, just off the streets, I'd consider it an absolutely terrible story. I wouldn't want to publish it, I just think it's hilarious.
No one would put any faith in this story. No one would back it enough for it to get published. But just because of who she is, it kind of has been saved as kind of a part of history. It shows that this kind of story wouldn't really get seen any other way.
Do you feel there's still a sense of that in contemporary culture? Where once a author is published and successful, they can do basically anything and people will lap it up.
Well, maybe that's a stretch. I think you have a lot more freedom once you've made a name for yourself, right? If you're Joe Bloggs off the street, then you gotta do what the publishers want. If you've already sold 500,000, then, they kind of have to give you a bit more free rein because clearly you know what you're doing. I'm not saying it's always right to give authors more agency when they're already got a track record. I think it's natural to do so. Obviously, it's not always going to work out.
I mean, writing's a business, so it makes sense in a business mindset to back people who have made you money before. I'm more likely to read authors I've known before and enjoyed than I am to completely pick up a new author if I've got a choice between the two.
At that point, just the fact that they wrote the story becomes a selling point and they don't have to worry too much about the other things, like making the story itself particularly appealing, because they already have proved themselves.
What do you think of Eliza?
She's terrible.
She's terrible.
She is. Do you disagree?
No, I just want to hear more about why she's terrible.
I mean, she throws her children out of a window. She robs her parents.
I mean, if you throw your children out of a window and they're fine, is it really a bad thing to do?
She says they're fine. That doesn't mean they're fine. Like she says they're sleeping peacefully. They could be comatose for all we know. They're clearly feral. They tried to bite off her fingers. They might have brain damage.
Yeah, okay. She is terrible, but I kind of like her. I was thinking about her a bit more and like, why do I like this lady? She has pretty much no dialogue. It doesn't really explain much about her character other than how wonderful and good she is. And I realized that I like her because she reminds me of our old friend Mary Sue.
Oh no.
Is that a reason to like someone?
It is when you're male.
I do. I can't help it. It just at that moment when I realized that this was Yodi fanfiction-esque, I suddenly fell in love with it just a little bit more.
Can you explain what a Mary Sue is?
Yeah, so a Mary Sue is a character who is faultless in the narrative. They are wonderful, perfect. All the characters fall in love with them. The name comes from the Star Trek fandom when people would write their own female characters to fall in love with either Kirk or Spock. And one of these stories got so notorious, their character who fell in love with, I don't remember which one of them it was, but she was called Mary Sue, and she had had a whole character archetype named after her.
A lot of the conversation around Mary Sue's, though, is specifically to do with female characters who, if they were male characters, would not be judged so harshly for being, as the plot has it, perfect.
There is a male version called Gary Stew, but it gets discussed much less often.
It specifically targets self-insert female characters to a certain extent, or overpowered women. A counterpart would often be just the traditional white, stereotypical everyman guy in fiction who everyone is in love with, even if you don't quite know why. He doesn't actually do anything all that great. He's got magic powers, and he's suddenly oh so powerful and better than everyone, despite the fact that he hasn't trained.
Yeah, and I think in this story, the Mary Sue-ness comes from the way the narrative and the other characters treat her. I guess apart from the Duchess, who is just evil and wrong, and everyone's glad when she gets what's coming to her at the end. And I just enjoyed that.
But can she really be a Mary Sue if Jane Austen isn't being sincere in the characterization? Like, it's very sarcastic or, like, kind of winking to the audience because we're both in on the joke. And Mary Sue, at least to me, has always felt more deliberate or serious. Like, it's someone trying to do a good character, but not realizing that maybe good characters need to have flaws.
Yeah, I think it's hard to extract the character from the style of the narrative, if that makes sense, especially because I guess it's from Eliza's point of view. But the story is so silly and whimsical that it's hard to tell which parts of the characterization being a bit wonky and which parts of the story just being weird.
Then if it's parodying the Mary Sue, that means that they existed when Jane Austen was writing stuff, and that's just so cool.
I mean, it could also be parodying the idea of the very virtuous protagonist who the only female characters you were allowed to depict really were the oh so amazing and good ones. Like you're either an angel or a monster.
Yeah, I think it's a play on that.
It's like Cinderella, she's gracious in the face of everything, when I would probably turn to stepsisters and like slap them or something. Like, don't get me wrong, I love the idea of her parodying a Mary Sue. And the idea of Mary Sue being around in Jane Austen's time is brilliant. I'm just not sure I believe it. I mean, obviously there were female characters around at that time. I'm just not convinced they were given the level of power and agency that Mary Sue requires. I don't know why Henry got top billing, considering he's dead halfway through.
Well, I know. I just enjoyed that even more. We don't know anything about him apart from he was supposed to marry Lady Harriet.
He dies so offhandedly as well. He's just gone. It's like, oh, he died.
Yeah, we don't know what he died of. He's clearly not important, which I kind of appreciated.
Maybe she murdered him.
I could believe it. Except if Eliza murdered him, she would have made sure she got more life insurance.
Could women claim life insurance?
I don't know.
Sorry, it's just on my mind because I was reading about how Jane Austen couldn't really get her works published because women weren't allowed to sign contracts at the time. So she had to get her father to do half of it and then...
Ugh, God. I can't imagine having my parents having to sign off my writing. Like, it would just be mortifying. I'd probably have a completely different writing style if I knew my parents were going to read my work.
Yeah, it's true.
Like, not to say that they don't read my published novels and stuff like that. People absolutely read them if they ever, get successful or whatever.
And her work was never published under her name until after she died.
What was she published as?
So originally it was just, I think, Sense and Sensibility. It was attributed to a lady, just a lady wrote this.
Poor Jane Austen.
And then later on it was from the author of Sense and Sensibility. They never named her.
I mean, I guess she would have got a lot of backlash in society and people would have changed the way they behaved around her if they knew who she was and that she was writing. And part of her skill as an author was observing society.
I don't know. I think they just were too not willing to admit that a woman could write.
I mean, a lady you'd think if that was the case, they would have picked a male pseudonym like they did with the Bronte sisters.
I was thinking they were published under Acton, weren't they?
Acton and Bell.
I think it's because her work was primarily targeted at women, and you had male publishers being like, well, women want to read this. Let's say a woman wrote it, and it probably won't even work because, women can't read.
Ah, that's so sad.
I don't know. I'm filling in a lot of the blanks here. I'm not really a historian, but it's just how it seems to me that they didn't really want to attribute any success to her and didn't really believe in it.
Yeah, I know it would have been a lot harder for her to get published being a woman.
And yet, she did end up being quite successful. So there you go.
Apparently it was quite common for the time to publish anonymously, especially for female writers, as it was not deemed ladylike to pursue a career in writing or publish for profit, according to Jane Austen info.
I guess this story is pretty unladylike.
Women of the gentry were not expected to pursue a profession. They were expected to marry well and for financial stability. It's also to avoid criticism for your works. Apparently, Mark Twain wrote after her death, "I want to dig her up and beat her over the skull with her own shin bone." And Charlotte Bronte is also apparently known for hating her. Personally, I think Mark Twain is jealous because I think Jane Austen is better, but
I thought I read something about Charlotte Bronte not really liking Pride and Prejudice, but I didn't know they hated her.
I mean, I'm reading off the Jane Austen info website, so, they may be exaggerating for dramatic effect. Like, you say you dislike one person and it blows out of proportion, doesn't it?
Next thing you know, you're beating her over the head with your shin bone.
Oh dear.
No, it does sound like something he would say, to be fair.
Sad that didn't make it into any of her stories.
I mean, she was dead at the time.
Nobody knew who she was until she died.
Yeah, no, apparently her family were all very encouraging about her publishing.
Pretty nice.
And her nieces would ask her for writing advice. Apparently her neighbour had no idea that she was Jane Austen, so she came and talked about the novel in front of Jane.
Oh wow, that's great.
To be fair, if I ever came across a party and people were talking about my work, I would absolutely feign to pretend to be someone else. I'd want to poke. Just because I'm not sure people will always give you an honest opinion to your face.
Ah, yes, you'd say Simone's work is quite good, but I'm not sure about the characterization, and you just poke them, would you?
Don't you think she's a bad person for writing villains? Clearly, we cannot condone this kind of thing in culture. We need to be more pure. You're romanticising it.
Oh, no, you don't want people to take that one seriously, though.
No, but it's one I've had before, which is why it came to mind.
So, what did we dislike about this story?
If you dislike something in this story, you have no heart.
Did we not cover early on in this podcast that we would never actually publish this? And don't think it would ever get published. And that's because we recognise that in terms of reading, it is not a very good story. It's a parody.
I don't know if I'd agree it's not a good story because I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I would say that's a problem with publishing, not a problem with the story.
Is that because you knew it was Jane Austen that you enjoyed it and were more willing to be generous towards it?
No, I think I'd like this story no matter who wrote it.
I mean, you probably would. It's up your street. It's ridiculous, but...
Yeah, my tastes are pretty absurd, so I'd probably be like, oh my goodness, this story is amazing.
I think it's important to know that a teenager wrote it, but even if you didn't know, I think you'd figure it out pretty quick.
It's got that vibe.
I think my main dislike is that things are glossed over when she could have added even more ridiculous detail. For example, we could have learned more about Henry or how she had her children. And I think that would have been really fun and great to know, because I bet it would have been as ridiculous as the rest of the story. So I guess what I dislike about this story is that I wish it was longer.
It's not my genre, I will admit. I can appreciate what she's doing, but I prefer my stories with an emotional character arc and, decent plotting. And I hate relying on coincidence. Like, I see what she's doing, and I appreciate it, but also it annoys me.
You mean just having the solution to the main character's problem in the same room? It's not good enough for you?
I know, like, the ladder's just in there. I read that and I screamed at my laptop, like, no! Come on!
Takes a lot to please Simone.
The ladder is in the prison cell. You've got to be the most incompetent villain who locks someone up with their means of escape.
I mean, the Duchess, she does seem to have a screw loose though, because she chased Eliza and Henry with 300 men to wherever they got the boat from, which is just seems excessive. And she doesn't seem very well liked.
I mean, Eliza's friend clearly liked her.
Oh, that's true, the lady at the bar.
And she didn't do anything wrong by Eliza. She was very generous in taking her in. Like, Eliza just came in and stole her fiancé or her daughter's fiancé. Like, I mean, justified. We don't have any sense of Henry and Eliza's relationship to, like, root for the underdog here. And, like, we never see her express any grief over her beloved husband's death.
How do you think Henry died?
Slipped on a banana peel.
Absurd accident.
No, I think he tripped over his gardener's rake and fell in the river and then got run over by a boat. Yeah, there you go.
Well, that's now my headcanon.
Either that or Eliza murdered him.
Just fits in so well.
Maybe Eliza was in the boat.
I was wondering whether accident should be in quotation marks or not.
And also the boat had like 500 guns.
You could see her, like, him screaming out for help and rescue while she just kind of goes by, like, dear, I have such a headache. Like, can you just keep it down a bit? But love, I'm dying. Yes, could you do that in your own time, please?
Perfect.
Most of the characters are named by title rather than name, which suggests that they're very quickly being used as a shorthand, like, archetype, which kind of adds to the sense of it being a parody, because they're not, like, fleshed out characters. They're representing something that probably might be clearer to Austen's audience than us.
She just couldn't be bothered to name them. Naming things is hard.
She has some great parody names in some of her other Juvenilia works, especially for places. I think one of the towns is called something like Plummy Diddle. I don't know. She clearly had fun with it, whatever she was doing. A couple of other of her stories go into things that she finds ridiculous, I suppose. There's one where one of the main characters is a lady who she's got this marriage proposal, but she hates the guy. She hates him so much because he won't buy her the carriage that she wants. And I think her mother's basically like, well, if you don't marry him, he's going to marry one of your sisters. And she's like, oh God, no, never. I can't let my sisters get married before me. I simply can't. So even though she hates him, she's like, oh God, I guess I have no choice but to marry him. And she checks with her sisters, and the sisters privately agree this man's horrible. They don't want to marry him. But when she says, oh, would you marry this guy? They're like, oh yeah, we definitely marry him. We definitely marry him.
Fair. All for one. One for all.
She basically ends up married to this guy just because she doesn't want her sisters to be married, and that feels very...
It's a very Jane Austen story, that.
But she often uses exaggeration for comic effect in her later novels, like with Miss Collins, for example, who is insufferable but often very exaggerated.
I was also thinking how she likes to point out how women were expected to marry for reasons that weren't really love, and how stupid that was. She likes to mess with that one a lot. Probably because it happened to her, I think. She married someone and then was actually like, I don't actually like him.
I mean, it would have been a problem at the time because you were expected to marry, so you kind of had to pick the best you had, didn't you?
Pretty messed up, and she decided to write about that.
And God, we're only pressured to marry these days rather than forced to.
One last detail, because a lot of what we know about Jane Austen has been through revisionist history, because her family seemed quite eager to cover up who she actually was, which is very strange. I guess they wanted to make this image of a very prim and proper lady, when it clearly was not true. I do like this one quote here, because a lot of what we know about her is from her letters, but a lot of her letters have ended up being destroyed. And her sister says that she destroyed these letters because to ensure that younger nieces did not read any of Jane Austen's sometimes acid or forthright comments on neighbours or family members.
Wow.
So there you go. Clearly spoke her mind, and family did not appreciate it.
As someone who doesn't think before they speak, destroying the letters is probably wise. If I die young, please go through my emails and delete everything in my history.
Okay, Is that your dying wish?
hmm
Okay, noted.
Like, I just feel like as authors, people just shouldn't get to know us too well.
It makes me wonder what she wrote. Like, what was so bad?
I imagine it wasn't really that bad.
It was so stuff like, oh, Mr. So-and-so has a big nose.
I mean, I imagine it was more witty.
My cousin would marry a snail if it asked her nicely enough.
Yeah, there's a story she wrote that's kind of like that. Not the snail bit. One of the ladies in it ends up with 2 marriage proposals, and she just says yes to them both without thinking, and then she's like, oh my god, I have a double engagement. The only solution is to throw myself into the river.
To be fair, that entirely sounds like something quite reasonable to do when you panic. Just say yes, not to throw yourself in the river. Elaborately fake your death to get out of your marriages, yes, but don't actually kill yourself.
I think she does die in that story.
Wow.
I know.
You think she'd just pick one?
I don't think she could. I guess it's quite savage.
Gosh, poor girl is that bad at making decisions.
I'm like, not that bad at making decisions, at least.
Yeah, I wouldn't throw myself in the river rather than turn down a suitor.
Which pudding do you want? I don't know. Into the river.
Let me kill myself over sticky toffee.
As you can tell, I had some fun reading other stories in her Juvenilia collection. Some of them were too long for me to consider them for the podcast, so I didn't. But there are 2 or 3 abandoned novels in there as well. I think the most famous one's called Sanditon, which were more Jane Austen-y than this story. I guess she probably wrote those when she was older. A lot of them use the names of people that she knew in real life or were based on people she knew.
Oh, didn't have babynames.com to look up baby names.
No.
How do you name your characters?
Same way you do, apparently.
What, babynames.com?
Yeah, I will admit to abusing it too.
I use words from other languages. I usually go for some really obscure meaning that's related to the story, but no one will ever notice.
I'm way too literal. I just did a navigator whose name meant hawk. So, subtle.
I mean, it's fine. I bet nobody knows anyway. It's not like you called him Hawk.
No, that would have just been a bit too much.
Even that might have been fine, depending on the story.
But I do like when you look up names and there's a meaning attached to it. Like, I don't think all names need to mean something. But it is a nice Easter egg when a name that isn't obviously meaning something to the plot actually means something to the plot when you look it up. It's like a nice Easter egg if you bother to do your research as a reader.
Yeah, that's what I aim for.
I think my favourite names are the names in Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, which are all translated from Japanese puns. The poor people who have to try and make these Japanese puns work in English are my heroes.
Alright, that's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening. As always, you can find this story in written form and all of our previous episodes at our website at www.shortstoryworkshop.com. If you'd like to contact us, you can do so via our Twitter accounts. I am at MattBWriter, Mel.
At Thickaholic.
And Simone.
T_M_typewriter, also known as the modern typewriter.
Alright, thanks again for listening, and we'll be back with another story again next week. Goodbye.
With the saw she instantly went to work, and in a few weeks had displaced every bar but one, to which she fastened the ladder. A difficulty then occurred, which for some time she knew not how to... What the...